Let's start then.
Alrighty, so for those that are interested, this is actually something I hope that the residents learn. We're going to do a step-by-step run through of how to do point-to-point registration in image guidance. This is not something that many of you have seen before. Most of you are unaware of it, but before OArm and Orbic existed, there was this thing called point-to-point registration, where you get a preoperative CT scan and then mark registration points preoperatively, and then go to the operating room and touch those points in the OR and match it to the CT scan. So it's everything that we do is essentially registering intraoperative anatomy to imaging anatomy. The OArm does it automatically because you get an image of the patient right away in the operating room. When I started doing this some 25 years ago now, the registration was all point to point. And in fact, probably the first dozen or so years of my practice, or 15 years of my practice, it was point to point registration. So everybody had a preoperative CT scan. I still get preoperative CT scans because there's areas where this sort of registration process is better. Primarily the cervical thoracic junction and the thoracic spine. This works out much better because the images are very sharp. You'll see when you do OArm imaging at the cervical thoracic junction, there's a significant fallout of the anterior vertebral bodies, and that's even using the lumbar spine settings on high definition, extra large stuff. Doesn't work out quite as well. And Vicus could probably tell you that we did this a couple of weeks ago, and that it actually was much nicer because the images were of really pretty good quality. And this will become more clear as we go on. The problem with our S8 stealths is that everything is set up to do it as OArm. And so I'll show you how to turn off the OArm so that this comes up. If you use machine number 3, there is a TROS no OArm protocol already on there. The CT scans that we get on people pre-op have a specific protocol they go through. The techs know what to do with it. Ideally, every time you register something, it's segmental. So if you're doing an L4, L5 fusion, you're putting screws in L4 and L5, you register L4 separately. So you put a reference frame on L4 and you pick the points on L4 and can really only accurately or be 100% certain that it's accurate by at L4, not at other levels. In the thoracic spine, because it doesn't move much, you can sometimes register multiple levels at once. The whole principle with that is that there may be a change in position of the vertebrae intraoperatively compared to preoperatively. Remember the pre-op scan is obtained with the person in a supine position, and typically we're operating in a prone position, so that if someone has a subluxation or spondylolisthesis, that the vertebral bodies may change position. So if you register L4, it's, for instance, an L5 slips a little bit further back, the registration won't be accurate. The way that we get around that intraoperatively when we use point-to-point navigation is we check our accuracy at each level. So you'll register one level, look at it, and say, okay, I'm going to touch points in this other level and see if they actually match the CT imaging. And the registration process was often the most difficult part of the whole thing. And people found it to be difficult and time consuming. And I'll tell you that after you've done it a while and you know exactly which points to pick, and I'll show you what the points I picked, it becomes pretty easy. It becomes very accurate. And in fact, the way that I typically do this is to pick 5 points preoperatively, touch those 5 points in the operating room, and then after that, there's the option to do what's called surface merge, which means you have your 5 points, which gets you sort of in the ballpark, but then you're allowed to pick 30 or more points that sort of hones in the accuracy of the image guidance. And that's something we'll have to do intraoperatively. This is not something I expect all of you to understand and remember every system, or every step, but you should at least remember it and having seen it and realize that there's another way to do it. So in my trauma patients, I used to just always make sure that the CT scan was done as a stealth protocol so that I could use that use that intraoperatively if I needed to. But this is still a way that I like to do it. The problem is that this isn't written up in any manual. I had to figure out with one of the reps how to get the steps to go through this. They're all there, but I imagine that if you do this with one of the reps, they may not exactly know how. You'll probably get some practice with doing this because some of this is used with the robot. So you may learn how to do this with the robot, but for sure we're going to have to sit down one-on-one and do this together. But I want to take you through all of the steps. So step number one, this button right here, this is the one in my office. I have a planning station in my office, which is probably the only one that exists because I'm actually the only one that really does a lot of preoperative planning. So turn the machine on. And this is what you see next. So I'll give you screenshots of everything that I do. You'll see there's a place to put in a password, and the password for everything is stealth and lowercase. All right, there's a touch screen here on the screen that you can just enter the numbers or the letters in to do that. Here's what typically shows up when you log in. You'll see one that says cranial and one that says spine. And since we're doing spine, we pick spine. And on my screen, you'll see two choices. And this is also on unit 3 in the operating room. There's one that's no OArm, and I'll show you what that means exactly, or standard profile. All the machines can actually do this. If you open up the standard profile, which is what we're going to do here, you'll see pelvic trauma and spinal fusion, and you'll pick spinal fusion. I hope that's what I did. Yep. And you'll see the instruments and so forth that you use in the procedure pop up on the screen next. So OArm, et cetera, et cetera. In order to do this without the OArm, you actually have to go to this drop-down list in the upper right corner, and you go to equipment, which is sitting right here. And when you click on that, then you'll see this thing come up with all the stuff that you're using intraoperatively. I'm going to try and move this thing because it's in the middle of my screen. And so there's a whole bunch of equipment that you can either add or subtract from this. If you go and click on this, what happens then is the OArm drops out of that equipment list and moves over here. The problem is if you go to use my no OArm protocol, if you turn this off in the OR, it won't come back on until you turn it back on. So you have to remember to go back to the equipment and add it back to the equipment list so the machine can be used with the OArm later on. So if you're in the operating room and all of a sudden you don't see the OArm show up, go to the equipment list and make sure that it's checked back on. So then you go back to the screen. You basically go back and click done right down here on the bottom. All right, and when you click done, this is what shows up now. Because with OArm, you just get the patient data and the patient information right in the operating room. So now you actually have to figure out where to get the information that you're going to use. So if you have a preoperative CT scan, you can see that there's various places that information may be available. The network, on this stealth, or on media, which is usually for me it's a disk, a CD drive disk, or it can be a USB port. But for this one, we're going to just say we're using the network. All the stealths have wireless capability. So what happens is you go and you put the patient's name in and you click search. And I put a patient's name in, and this is a guy that we're doing next week, Friday. And you'll see the list of all the studies that have been done, with some other names that aren't in there. But you'll see there's a seat that's a CT stereotactic localization. So you click on that, and then you get a whole bunch of choices that pop down here. These are all the series within the study that have been done. The thing is, you'll see this one that says stealth, and this one I think it says thin slice something or other. Stealth. I usually pick the thin slice one, even though I'm sure it's the same data set as this. All right, and then you can see that I've got it on download. So it downloads, and in the lower right corner, you can just follow the progress of the download. All right, so patient name, and this one is just about done. All right, and once you're done, you look in the upper right corner, which is right above that progress piece, and it'll show you the patient's name. So if you click on that, it loads up his study. All right, so here's Patrick's study for next week. It loads it up, and so that's what it looks like when you get going. You'll see it. There's a variety of things that you can do with this, and I essentially do registration and planning. If you look at this, when it first comes up, it comes up in the prompting you to go to planning. I tend not to do that first. I tend to do my registration first. So if you look in this drop down list up here, when you click on it, so these are all the things that you can do, the images, but when you click on that, you'll see a bunch of things come up, including the processes that we like to do, the registration and the planning, and you can add instruments and so forth. But so I would go to hit the registration, and as it does that, then it brings up a series of 4 panels. For registration, I use anatomic images. So you'll see a sagittal, a coronal, and an axial. And this is just for picking points. You'll see the registration 3D down here. It does not look very good right now. So, and that's how it always comes up. So what you do is you have to edit the model. And that's what this whole thing refers to. Editing model is the registration 3D model. And you see a series of slider bars here on the right side. And primarily the one, you almost never have to do anything with this one that says upper. You play with the lower one. And the way to get all this stuff away from it is usually just to slide this to the right some. And as you do that, you'll see the image start to change. All right, you move a little more right, and it looks like this. All right, so now it also looks like a spine. I'll tell you, the reason I like getting CT scans on people ahead of time is because this spina bifida this patient has was not really noticeable on his MRI to any significant degree. So that'll help us plan things in the operating room. You see this image doesn't look very good yet. And you can slide this bar over and it'll get to be pretty perfect. But the reason I left it like this was I wanted to show you that there's this ability to really hone it in and make it look good by using these advanced functions. So if you click on the advanced functions, you'll see a variety of things come up below the advanced, right? And the ones that I primarily want you to look at are filling holes and removing islands. All right, so all these little dots out here are little islands. And if you click on remove islands, it does this. So now it gives you a pretty good looking 3-dimensional image. All right, and then we'll go and click done because we're done playing with that. So you click done. And then you have these images. All right, so now how do you pick the registration points? Well, once again, we go back up here and we click on registration, which I've done. I probably zoom this in a little bit. So click on registration, as you can see here. And then you see this pop up in the right-hand side. Okay, so this is for touching points, and this is the surface merge. You'll use this intraoperatively. So to go and add your registration points, you just move your cursor and put it on whatever you want. So in this one, my typical registration points are tips of transverse processes in the midpoint, fairly distal on it. So you look at all 3 images. Okay, so the axial, you put it out here towards the end, sagittal on the dorsal surface, and then usually on the coronal, you can barely see anything in it. And to add that point, you just hit plus. What pops up then is this 1. All right, so now to get a second point, you do the same thing. You just take the cursor, put it on a point that you think you can identify in the operating room. And the one thing about these points is they should all be spatially is pretty far separated and 3-dimensionally in different planes. All right, so I pick this spinous process and hit plus. Same thing happens is it puts that point on, and then we go to a third point, which for me is typically the superior facet of that vertebrae, sort of in the midline. at its apex. This is not quite a good one to look at, but you'll see it's sort of right on this most superficial surface. You do the same thing on the other side. All right, do that and hit the plus sign, and that adds it. And then the tip of the spinous process is the last thing that I use. All right, so once again, points you can identify that are three-dimensionally separated in space. All right, so that's easy. Now, how do you add another level? Right, so you got L4 done, and then this is sort of the part that doesn't make it's not very intuitive, right? So this is one thing you just have to remember to do when you do it, and you go to previous registrations. So you hit this previous registration, as I've shown here with the cursor, hit previous registration, and then what happens is on the right side of the screen you'll see the current pop up, and it'll say other. This is the original data set that we had without any points on it. This is the point. This is the one that we just did. If you want to name it, you can click on this gearbox, these gears that are over here, and what'll happen is it'll pop up and show you where you can just type in a name. And then the other thing you do is if you want to add another set is you go to this one that says other, okay, other, click on the gearboxes. And what happens then is you get a series of choices down here. So set as current, duplicate, or delete. And so if you do this as set as current, all right, as I've marked here, so set as current, and then you get the same thing that you started with. All right, and so now what do you have to do? You have to go and edit the model, right? Which once again brings up the cursors, and you get the cursors all. You move the cursors around as we talked about in the first level to get this image. So every time you add another level, it ends up giving you that same lousy 3D image, and then you just pick your next level and go ahead and do the same thing. Pick your point. So tips of transverse processes, tip of a spinous process, and the superior facets. All right. So now we're going to go and do our planning. You could stop right at this point with the registration points and just go to the operating room and use that. This is just a way to get the imaging data and the intraoperative anatomy to be registered to one another. But I'm going to show you planning because it's sometimes useful to do that. So up here in this drop-down list, so remember we go back to this drop-down list for our main functions. I pick planning, and it puts up this stuff. These images are once again the same anatomic images that we did before, and this is just a 3D that I never use. So the thing that's important about this is you want to choose images for your planning that are basically in a Cartesian plane around your probe that you're pointing with. All right, so it's basically what's said to be orthogonal to the pointer. So everything is at a right angle to the pointer. So everything that you do with the pointer shows you how you can go directly down the pedicle and lines things up for you. So you have to remember to change that. And you could do that just by going to the drop-down list here, here, and here, and even here. So I changed this to trajectory 1. This goes to trajectory 2. This go to probe's eye, and this goes to, and I like the registration 3D, registration 3D, which is also in this list. You could also use something called a synthetic lateral, which basically just looks like a lateral X-ray. All right, so we did that, and so we changed them to the images that are orthogonal. So you'll see this says trajectory 1, trajectory 2, probe's eye, all right, and then the registration 3D. Now you have to put plans on here. And the way to do that is you go to these ribbon looking things, which says saved items, and click on it. All right, so saved items, and click on it. And now you got to decide, am I going to add an implant or a projection? Well, it turns out the only thing you really have to do is hit this plus sign, and it picks it for you. So what comes up now is this box, all right, that allows you to have a projection that's a cylinder. It allows you to set an entry point and an end point. The length will come up automatically when you do that, and you can adjust the diameter of the screw. All right, so I think I'll let Vicus do this one, but no, I did this myself. Pick an entry point that you think is reasonable. I usually will do it on this 3D image, so pick an entry point. All right, and then I pick so pick the entry point, hit set entry. All right, pick your endpoint, something like this, and hit set endpoint. So then what happens is you get this basically virtual screw that you put in. And there's a whole bunch of ways to go and change it so it looks perfect. You can go back and adjust your entry point or your end point. I'll show you the easy way to do this, okay? So the easy way to do this is go to the shift button. All right, shift and left mouse together. And what that does is that allows you to grab an end of the screw. All right, so when you hit the shift button, you'll see this thing sort of pop up in these three images. That means that you're going to do something with something in this box. You have to have all these other things turned off, so you can't have the zoom on or the adjust width or anything, because what happens when you move the mouse is it uses this as the main function. So you'll be zooming in and zooming out and doing all sorts of crazy things. So make sure that those are all off before you go and start doing it. So I don't have an action video. I have a video that I made of this too. But essentially all you do is you just drag the tip of the screw where you want it, drag the entry point where you want it, so it gets just perfect. All right. So now you want to add another screw. So this gets you one screw, and you can see that this screw can be about a 6.5 by 46.5. That just measures this length. You know the screw will be sitting up here somewhat, with the head of the screw up a little bit higher. So to get another point in here, you hit plus again. All right, and that brings up cylinder 2. And you can name these things too if you want. I just never name them. But then you go back and repeat the same thing by setting an entry, setting an endpoint, and then it drops a screw down for you, okay? And you can do that with all of your screws. And it's sometimes helpful to do that so you know how big your screws are going to be. On occasion, you'll find some of your thoracic screws may only be 4.5 millimeters, so you'll know you'll have to grab a different set of screws. It helps you to be prepared in the operating room for that, because the screws that are not 5.5 or 6.5 in diameter are often not around, or in a different set, so you can tell your tech to get it set up. So if you do this on a planning station, you have to do something to get that data from the planning station into the stealth that you're using. If you do the planning on a stealth unit, it's easy. You have it there right away. If it's not, then you have to export the data, which is what this says. So you go to this drop down list again up here, right? Remember I told you that's where you go to get all your major functions, your planning, your registration, and then your export function. All right, so when you click on export, you have to have something to export it to, and it can be a disk, or it can be a USB drive if you want. I tend to use these disks. I just have 100 in my office, so I've got to get rid of them. You can do a USB drive also. All right, when you put the disk in, you get these things that pop up. It says unable to mount blank CD-R disk. Just click OK and it disappears. And then what will pop up is this thing that says you've inserted a disk, and choose what application you'd like to do with it. I just hit OK. I have no idea what it does. And then this thing shows up, that talks about the CDDVD Creator folder. Just close it. And then what happens is you choose a destination, and what pops up is UW-PACS, a file system, or CD. If you don't have in the drive, this option won't show up, and you can't save it to these other things. So make sure that you have the disk inserted. Same thing with a USB drive, it'll show up. And then this is what shows up, and all you're going to export are patient images. All right, and if you get the disk in and get the study ready to go, this pops up, and then you just click export, and then it transfers it to a disk, which you can see happens here, and you can follow its progress. All right, and then it finishes up, and then remember that if you're doing this in the OR, the rude thing to do is to leave this turned off, or if someone has been rude and has turned off the OArm, or you can't get the OArm to say that it's connected or that it's available as equipment, remember to go to that big series of lines up here, the drop down list of the major functions, go back to equipment. All right, and what'll happen is you'll have all that stuff minus the OArm, and the OArm will show up in this list, and click plus or add, and that'll get the OArm back in. Okay, so when you click it, OArm will show back up, and then it's ready to go for people that are going to use the OArm. And I'm not going to show you how to shut this down. You all should know how to do that. So I know that was probably not very exciting, but it's a useful skill that you should have. I'll bet the senior residents, many of them have probably never seen this. And I'd sort of forgotten that you guys didn't know how to do this. And when we got the new S8s, I said, maybe we should know how to do this, because there are places where I do continue to do it. That being said, I'm not sure what the easiest way to follow up on this is, other than to make each of you come to the OR once and plan a case with me, which you may or may not find very exciting. Right, Vicus?
Yeah.
Vicus taking a nap.
Nope. I'm just getting the mic on.
Yeah. I think
yeah,
you probably thought it was pretty good when we did it with the cervical thoracic junction stuff.
Yeah. The other thing is, did you say when you put the stealth on, do you put it on separately on L4 and L5, or can you just put it on L5 and do
the registration? So you can
Yeah.
you can choose just to put the reference arc on one spinous process. The key is that the reference arc doesn't move in a relationship to the vertebrae you're registering. Right? So that's why we say if we're going to register L4, we typically would put it on L4 and mark pick the points and register them, and then really only navigate L4. That's the purest way to do it. But typically what'll happen is I'll pick the most caudal spinous process and put it on there. So if we're doing L1 to 5, I'll just put it on L5 and just know that I can't hit the reference arc. You guys know that I'm really fussy about never touching the reference arc once it's put on. That also goes for OArm also, is once you've done your spin, which is the registration process, that reference arc cannot move in relation to the vertebrae. So if someone bumps it or does something, it can lead to inaccuracies. That's the reason that the cervical spine is so hard to use image guidance on, because the cervical spine is so flexible that every time you push a little bit on the spine, it moves, so it becomes inaccurate. And really, the only level that's truly 100% accurate is the one that the reference arc is attached to that you've registered. All right, any other questions?
So, Greg, in the OR, you just do that touch registration where you basically put the pointer at those 4 individual points at each level, and that's how
Those 5
or 5 points at each level, and that's how it's registered then?
Yes, that's how you couple the intraoperative anatomy to the imaging anatomy.
Okay.
The thing is, it's maybe never quite as accurate as you want. If I go back to just see when I talked about that thing that's at surface, in reality, what I always do is I go to those points and touch them, but then I go to the surface merge. The surface, what happens is you touch 30 points, at least 30 points in your registration field. So you pick, things along the side of the spinous process and out along the transverse process. And every time you pick a point, you click on you hit the foot switch. And then what happens is the computer algorithm models all those points to fit the CT anatomy. So it really makes it quite accurate. And in fact, it won't let you use it unless it's within a millimeter accuracy at 6 centimeters from the tip. So it's really accurate. And this is a very, very accurate way to do this as long as you follow principles.
Yeah, I guess that's what we are all used to doing for cranial cases, just surface registration where you just run the tracer on the patient's scalp and it captures the points. I was just curious whether it was as accurate for doing it over the bony anatomy. Sounds
So
like it is.
if you put fiducials on the head and touch the fiducials one by one,
Yep.
then it'll be, at least accurate to the surface. The problem with the skin stuff is that it can change position between your imaging. So this is highly accurate. This is as accurate as using OArm. And I think the tracing process you guys do is different than this. It's not point-to-point registration. All right. Any other questions or comments?
Would it make more sometimes large pedicles to do it this way and save a CT scan, extra CT scan? Or
what you could use it for for single level cases. It actually moves along pretty quickly. This doesn't really add time to using OArm. So if you did a single level and say I want to do this with single level, yeah, you could easily just do this as opposed to getting an OArm spin. I like the OArm too because it confirms what you've done afterwards. But for a single level, yeah, you could. For any model levels, you could certainly do this. It's highly accurate. That's what I did for 15 years before we got all these other devices. All right. I have a video of this too, you guys, that we can somehow make available. And then I want each of you to come to me individually as residents to come and watch how this is done. Either in my office, you can come and say you got a case on Friday. I want to do it, and we can practice it because I think it's a really useful skill to have, and it's a skill that not a lot of people do have. All right, you guys.
Thanks a lot,
I'll let you
Greg.
go early.